be very agile and nimble because the industry changes so quickly. You can't rely on what you're used to historically or in the past because that has all changed. The industry's changed, and it's not just the airline industry that's seen this.
Welcome to another episode of the e-commerce toolbox expert's perspective. Joining us today, we have Jake Maloney. Jake is the former director of e-com and digital products at Frontier Airlines. Was there for the best part of 7-8 years. So really excited to have you on the podcast today, Jacob.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
Cool. We always like to learn a bit more about your career journey and how you ended up in your role. So why don't you kick us off with what you studied and how you ended up at Frontier?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually started my career in graphic design back in 2001, just as print was starting to kind of decline. So I quickly realized everything was shifting towards digital, but digital user experience was still kind of in its infancy. Most companies, especially small and medium-sized businesses, weren't really thinking about the customer-facing side of web yet. And even in college, like the curriculum wasn't really focused on the user experience side of things, or the digital customer experience was more heavily back-end, .NET, C#, that kind of stuff. And so no one was really talking about how digital tools could directly reach and convert customers. And I saw a really big gap there and a pretty huge opportunity. So I started a digital design and advertising and consulting firm focused on helping SMBs build modern digital experiences. That work kind of evolved over time from front-end UX and brand strategy to full digital commerce and transformation. Eventually, I transitioned into an in-house product leadership roles where I could drive deeper, more lasting impact at scale. And most recently, I served as director of e-commerce and digital products at Frontier, where I led the digital experience across web, mobile, airport kiosks, modernizing booking flows, increasing conversion, and building resilient kind of infrastructure. And this is a pretty high pressure industry. So I've worn a lot of hats from design to product to tech, marketing. Yeah, so really excited to share more about that and how I create high performing digital ecosystems, especially when there's zero room for downtime.
Very cool. And obviously you came from an industry outside of aviation. Maybe talk to us a bit about what surprised you the most when you got and started looking under the hood of an e-com operation in that industry.
Yeah, the airline industry was incredibly fascinating and probably one of my favorite industries that I've worked in over the last 20 plus years. But what surprised me is how complex it is and how quickly the industry changes. Pricing volatility, regulatory constraints, there's a lot of legacy infrastructure and a lot of really high customer expectations. And so navigating all of that and really putting together trusted customer experiences while bringing operational efficiency was incredibly difficult, but really exciting work.
Talk to me a bit about ancillary revenue. I know that's a really important part of online transaction volume and just profitability for low-cost airlines. So yeah, maybe talk to us a bit about some of the projects and how you kind of navigated influencing cross-functional teams from IT to marketing to boost ancillary revenue.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, ancillary revenue is kind of the bread and butter for ultra low cost carriers, right? So key to that is keeping our costs as low as possible. And Frontier was incredibly successful at keeping costs low. That really allowed Frontier to offer those extremely low fares. As part of that, the profit margins on the fare side are pretty small. So ancillary revenue is incredibly important. And as part of that, the pricing strategies, offering dynamic pricing based on historical information or real-time data that we're getting as the customers are navigating the website is incredibly important. So driving change cross-functionally was incredibly important. Working with pricing and revenue management, IT operations, loyalty, navigating the tensions between short-term revenue and long-term trust was really important. And we've had, throughout the years there, a lot of trials and tribulations on focusing too heavily on non-ticket, and then the pendulum kind of swinging a little bit too far in that direction. And load and ticket revenue kind of took a hit, right? Because we really started to, in an attempt to try to maximize that non-ticket, we kind of, I wouldn't say forgot, but the focus was just too much on ancillary. So we had to kind of reground ourselves and make sure we were meeting the middle ground between ticket revenue and ancillary revenue and really getting that load factor, filling the planes, really, that's the most important thing, right? You want what we like to say is butts and seats, but you also got to sell those third party and internal ancillary products.
And obviously, your scope was anything from digital resilience to even UI UX. Do you have something that you could maybe share on the UI UX side where we all know kind of small changes could have large impacts? Maybe help quantify how small of a change and how large of an impact based on your experience.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that were incredibly great learning experiences, not only for myself and the team, but for executive leadership, right? And they're always looking for those big swings. And I think there's not always a lot of focus on those small wins, oftentimes, right? And so we did this revamp of the Discount Den, which is our low fare club, the merchandising experience. And one of the things that I tried to drive them towards is let's make some small incremental user experience and merchandising changes, really just to placements, CTAs, and verbiage. And the leadership side was really skeptical that it was actually going to have the impact that it did. But what happened was we ended up just from those small tweaks, ended up with a 60% uplift in new memberships. And I believe it was like a 35% renewal and retention uplift. And so, like I said, what that showed is that even very small tweaks and improvements to user experience can have really, really big impacts.
That's crazy. That's a big, big, big change. And when you went through that funnel, right, there's obviously multiple levers you could pull. You can change the UI, you could make the website faster, you could reduce failure rates on APIs or errors. Talk to me a bit about performance and how you looked at those kind of high traffic flows. Did you do any kind of experimentation there and investment? And what were some of the results?
Yeah, it's interesting. So back when I started, we didn't have the tooling to be able to do like true experimentation. So we used to do what we call poor man's A/B testing. And you push the code out, you try something for a couple of weeks. If it's not working, you rip it out and you re-strategize. And so we've gotten a lot more intelligent and invested in technology since then, which has opened up the door for us to do actual true experimentation and feature flagging. But one of the things you mentioned was performance, right? And so coming into a pretty legacy system and a website that had been around for the better part of 7, 8 years, the technology had started to kind of fall behind. And Frontier, from a brand and customer experience perspective, had also kind of fallen behind some of the other airlines who were really starting to invest in digital and customer experience. And so we decided to kind of go real greenfield and kicked off a project to build a brand new website, brand new mobile app from the ground up, and get in new tooling. We invested in some enterprise analytics tools, a new enterprise content management system that allowed the business and the commercial division to not only move a lot faster, but kind of lessen the dependency on the IT side and development cycles. But as part of that, you mentioned performance, and a lot of that comes into play as the architecture behind the scenes, right? The middleware, the API layer, and really regrounding that and making sure that it was efficient. Downtime from a digital perspective on an airline can quite literally ground revenue. If the site goes down or if people can't check in, they can't get their boarding passes, it has a true impact on the operation. And so uptime and technology efficiency is really important.
It makes sense. Obviously, it doesn't just stop booking revenue, but it could also really impact like check-in and other kind of critical things. Yeah, talk to me a bit about how you built resiliency and kind of how you thought about your observability slash resiliency stack. How did you kind of architect that and how did you balance that against making sure that your teams are always A/B testing to try and push the website forward?
Yeah, so I mentioned resilience and reliability from a digital perspective, but the team also needs to be highly focused on a frictionless experience from a customer perspective, right? So you've always got to keep the customer at top of mind, make sure that there's failovers, and a part of that is investing in tooling, and that's why we invested in Noibu and built that partnership with you all to be more proactive in identifying issues before it turns into a true downtime scenario, right? Or even just customer pain points. Are we introducing like dark patterns in the UI UX? Are there ways to make things more intuitive? how can we empower the customer to self-serve? So all of that comes into play when you talk about the resiliency of the team as well as the efficiency of the technology.
Makes a lot of sense. And actually, a question for you. Do you think airline companies are kind of in this unique situation where they have to interact with a lot of legacy systems and it might be a bit like banking versus traditional e-com where it's like kind of hard to rip and replace your ERP that was built in the 70s, for example? I don't know if that's the case at Frontier, but yeah, I'm curious. Like, I know just from working with some of the airlines like you guys and some others that we work with that that's a bit of a challenge. Maybe talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, that is a huge challenge, and it's funny you bring up banking. That's something that I always said is it reminded me a lot of legacy banking systems in that they're very heavy. There's a lot of technological hurdles. The commercial team might want to do something, and the technology just doesn't support. And so you've got to find ways to work around that to bring the best experience, whether that be self-service or whatever it is, to the customer. And so one example I could give is the Kids Fly Free program, where we introduced a new discount den benefit where certain days, certain routes, discount den members, their kids can fly for free. And part of being that highly regulated industry, you can't actually advertise and call things free unless they're truly free. And a lot of times when airlines offer a free something, you still have to pay the taxes and fees. And so the DOT doesn't allow us to advertise that as truly free. Well, the technology did not support what we were trying to do. You couldn't waive the taxes and fees via the technology. So we had to come together from a technology perspective, me and the architects and the engineers. I started kind of a technology focused like war room for us to get together and come up with ways to think out of the box on how we get around the technology hurdles of that problem. And it worked. We launched the product. It's still live today, and it's been a great benefit to the customer and the program overall. So those legacy systems were always an interesting hurdle to get around, but it just forces you to think outside the box.
Makes a lot of sense. And how did you balance build versus buy when it came to producing software and technology, given that a lot of the use cases might not have been as straightforward enough to be able to just plug and play a random third party software? Like, how did you guys pick which bets to build and which bets to buy when it came to software?
Yeah, from my perspective, it was usually around cost and speed to market. So something like a content management system or an A/B testing or personalization engine, those are things that other companies have spent millions of dollars and years of research in and isn't really something that makes a lot of sense for us to build. And so those are times when you buy things like fare caching. So I look at it like this. If we have the data internally or we have the systems internally that can support something, why would we buy a product to feed somebody data and then pay them to get our data back? So an example of that could be fare caching. We've got the data, we've got the systems, let's build our own fare caching. So that's a perfect example of a build versus a buy.
Very interesting. I mean, it makes sense. It's kind of like there's like a Venn diagram of cost, quality, and then how quickly you can get it to market. As we look to wrap up, how do you think? Obviously, we went through the pandemic boom. I'm assuming obviously that impacted airlines a lot differently. There was a halt, and then there was kind of probably a travel boom that came on the back of that. So, do you have any advice for kind of digital leaders when it comes to dealing with more legacy industry? Maybe you guys have some tech debt that you can't really escape and you're dealing with thin margins in a super, super competitive market. I don't think any of that is a secret or controversial. Yeah. Do you have any opinions on how to deal with that and high level? Because ultimately that just typically leads to high pressure, right?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And the pandemic was really interesting, right? And so coming out of that, I don't think anybody, the airlines, other industries had never really experienced something like that. You'll hear a lot of these airline executives talk about the pandemic was actually worse than when 9/11 happened from not only a sentiment perspective or like a customer behavior perspective, but it was just really uncharted territory. And so you had this extreme pent up demand coming out of that. People were locked up in their houses, they weren't traveling. And so there was a lot of pent up demand. But I think what we've seen since the pandemic is customer behavior changes so quickly and their expectations change so quickly, especially since the pandemic. You really have to meet people where they're at. And so I think a lot of times Historically, airlines kind of just assumed people are going to travel, they're always going to be there, the customer is always going to come to us. And now it's different, and customer expectations are incredibly different. And so you've got these low cost carriers that were kind of no frills, no premium offerings. And we're seeing that expectation from a customer perspective change significantly. And they do have an expectation of more premium amenities, more reliability. They expect to get to their destination and get there on time, but they also want a premium experience throughout that journey. And so you're going to see a lot of low cost carriers, especially, start to really focus and hone in on that premium experience. Another thing that we saw coming out of the pandemic was the ultra low cost carriers could play in that low fare game all day long and they would be fine because their costs were low. And the legacies never really touched that. The pandemic kind of forced them to really start to play in that low fare game. And so coming out of that, the low cost carriers no longer had that cost advantage or that low fare advantage, because now there's maybe like a $40, $50 differential between a United and a Frontier or a Spirit. And so the low cost carriers are really starting to have to focus on premium amenities, better seats, refundability, more premium ancillaries. And the great thing about Frontier was they were incredibly well positioned to actually do that, and do that at a really good value because their costs are so low. And so any advice I would give is maintain absolute focus on the customer, meet them where they're at, be very agile and nimble, because the industry changes so quickly and customer expectations change so quickly. You can't rely on what you're used to historically or in the past, because that has all changed. The industry's changed. And it's not just the airline industry that's seen this, right? I think broadly speaking, e-commerce is seeing customer sentiment and customer expectations change. But I think it's impacting the airline industry pretty heavily.
Very cool. And thanks so much for your time, Jake. Really appreciated your insights. Best of luck, and thanks again.
Yeah, appreciate the time. Thanks for having me.
The e-commerce toolbox Expert Perspectives is brought to you by Noibu. To find out more about Noibu and how we can help you debug your e-commerce site and rocket your revenue, visit www.noibu.com. That's noibu.com. And then make sure to search for the e-commerce toolbox Expert Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found, and click subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Noibu, thanks for listening.